Whether it was a mutiny or a coup, the Wagner mercenary group's threat to advance into Moscow was the biggest threat to the Kremlin in decades. The immediate danger was short-lived, but has Yevgeny Prigozhin's so-called March for Justice done long-term damage to the standing of Vladimir Putin? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. Vladimir Putin's power in the Kremlin has always appeared unassailable. But then last month, Russia's biggest warlord, a man known as Putin's chef, took over the southern city of Rostov. And for a few hours, it seemed like mercenaries belonging to Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner group would even enter Moscow itself.
On the 23rd of June, the whole world watched in shock as the armed Wagner group commanded by Yevgeny Prigozhin advanced seemingly unopposed towards Moscow with an estimated 5,000 fighters. They'd already taken control of the southern city of Rostov-on-Don. Prigozhin was demanding the head of Russia's armed forces and the head of the defense ministry be removed from their jobs immediately. This was the biggest challenge to the Russian president's power ever. However, the mutiny came to an abrupt end after a day amid rumours of a deal brokered by Belarus's president. Perhaps the main question now is to what extent did it weaken Putin's strongman image, both in the eyes of the West and Putin's allies, both international and domestic. Putin was quick to reassure his Asian allies.
I would like to thank my colleagues from the SCO countries who expressed support for the actions of the Russian leadership to protect the constitutional order, the life and security of Russian citizens. We highly appreciate it.
Prigozhin said he had called off his operation after agreeing to lead his forces into Belarus, and Putin says despite events that Russia is united.
The Russian people are consolidated as never before. The solidarity and high responsibility for the fate of the fatherland was clearly demonstrated by the Russian political circles and the entire society by coming out as a united front against the attempted armed rebellion.
Is Vladimir Putin right about the unity that surrounds him?
So, to discuss the consequences of the Wagner mutiny, I'm joined by Sean Bell from Manchester. He's a retired Air Vice Marshal, former fighter pilot, and now a military analyst. Meanwhile, in Nottingham, we have Colin Alexander. He's a senior lecturer in political communications at Nottingham Trent University. And in London, we have Paul Ingram, who's a senior researcher at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. Sean, I'm going to come to you first, if I can. This Wagner, I'm going to call it a mutiny. We'll open up in a little bit if it's a mutiny or if it's a coup. But if we start out calling it a mutiny, how has it affected Putin's strongman image, in your opinion?
Well, from a purely military perspective, other panelists will have a view on the politics side. I'm sure he will have been alarmed at just how quickly Yevgeny Prigozhin was able to make his way up the M4, not to Bristol, but up towards Moscow. And as to his image, there's a domestic and then there's the international side. Undoubtedly, from a warfighting perspective, if I was Putin, I'd be now looking to bolster my domestic security. That will bring troops out of Ukraine where they're fighting. I'll also be a bit concerned about using large mercenary groups. Yet Putin has relied heavily on mercenary groups for success on the battlefield, and therefore also it will have had an effect on morale adversely on the Russian forces that are deployed in Ukraine, and therefore will undoubtedly be a bit of a fillip to Ukrainian forces.
Colin, I'm assuming you're in agreement with that.
Very much so, yes. Authoritarian leaders depend upon an aura around them. And how they manufacture that is, differentiates from leader to leader. But certainly Putin has gone for a very much a sort of an emphasis upon his masculinity. And the problem with that is that it's vulnerable to attack and it's vulnerable to being shed where there are challenges to his authority. And quite clearly last Saturday, we saw somebody who was rattled and probably rightly to be so as well. So the wider question for the medium to long term is what does this do? Does this inspire others look upon Putin differently, and certainly look upon the Kremlin as not perhaps the sort of bastion that it claims to be.
Well, I'll put that to you then, Paul. What do you make of this? Is Putin still in a sort of an unassailable position, as it were? Because it would appear that he was over the previous decade at least. Now he looks just a little bit weaker, doesn't he?
Well, he certainly looks it. I'm no Kremlin watcher. I wouldn't presume to know exactly what's going on in that part of the Russian state. But it does look very worrying for Putin, and certainly, undoubtedly, will increase the sense that if there's anybody out there that wants to challenge him, now is a much better time to do so than it was just a few weeks ago. And I don't know what impact it will have on the Russian forces and their unity, but I can't imagine it's very comfortable place, particularly after we saw the scenes in the Russian towns that had been taken over by the Wagner group, and the support that there was clearly for Wagner as opposed to the more established forces. So I think it adds a significant degree of uncertainty, which I'm sure we'll come to in terms of the consequences.
Sean, let me bring this across to you then. I mentioned back at the start, is this a coup or is this a mutiny? There's been sort of lots of different ways of debating this out in the press. What's your feelings? What's your view on this?
I think in the West, we're trying to pigeonhole these actions into a particular narrative. What looks most likely, I think, is Yevgeny Prigozhin. If you recall, his Wagner forces were told that by the 1st of July, they had to sign up to the MOD, that they were having their power and independence taken away from them. Prigozhin was immensely frustrated at Gerasimov, General Gerasimov, the boss of the Russian forces, and Sergei Shoigu, their defense minister. And this seemed to be more a reaction against them. But the ease with which he walked into the Russian headquarters, then in the city, as colleagues have just spoken about, I suspect he started to gain a degree of momentum and potentially started to believe this could be something a bit more special. And we can only surmise what happened in the conversations. It does appear that he tried to call Putin. That failed. Lukashenko intervened, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Colin, for you, is this a coup or a mutiny?
Prigozhin has come out and said himself that it wasn't a coup. Whether we believe that or not is another matter. It certainly was a mutiny, or at least a disgruntlement at what was happening, as has just been said. My analysis of it is that there is a potentially, I'm not saying that I believe this, but there's a potentially a third way of looking at this, in that it was a theatrical performance as well, in that he sort of strode along the M4 in the June sunshine, doing what Napoleon and Hitler could only dream of doing. There's also a Wagner-esque to this, in the sense of the namesake Richard Wagner and the kind of Ride of the Valkyries style, which has been used in things like Apocalypse Now as well. So I don't know. There's quite a few different angles that you can go at with this, and that what Prigozhin was doing was essentially a show of military theatrics, which had the audience captivated, and including myself in that, in terms of Saturday afternoon was an incredible moment, and I did begin to wonder whether this was more created for our benefit rather than being something which we should see as being entirely serious.
Paul, if I bring this over to you, Wagner obviously has a lot of different roles as far as the Russian state is concerned. It's had soldiers, of course, in Ukraine who've been used on the front lines, but it's also sort of a tool of foreign policy. And Russia has found it very useful to be able to send soldiers to places like Mali, other areas around southern Africa, also across in the Americas, parts of Asia too, while at the same time being able to say, well, that's got nothing to do with us. This is a private military contractor. It's in no way an extension of the Russian state. Do you think this whole sort of coup situation and the fact that they've got to reorder the management of this organization is going to blow that open as an untruth?
Well, there was chicken and egg here because the actions by the Wagner Group were triggered by the efforts of the Russian army to incorporate Wagner into the regular army, or at least that's what we're led to believe. I mean, there's so many dimensions of this story that are quite extraordinary. We also need to recognise that it's not just the Russian state that does this. We have private military companies operating across the world from many states, including the United States, the UK, and other European states. So this isn't just a Russian activity, if you like. And the expansion of private military companies across the world has been catalogued at quite some depth by fellow researchers of mine, and the conclusion is that alongside a culture in the civil world of privatization, the privatization of military forces has been extensive and has been used by states such as the Russian government in very effective ways. I don't see that this will change by this experience. I think that they are useful, but of course, when you do operate in the shadows like this, it's very difficult to keep control of your forces when they are at such arm's length.
Sean, you of course were in the military as an air vice marshal, so I suppose I should put it to you: is Wagner different from, say, the American or the British variants of private military contractors, or is it just a Russian flavour of the same?
It's difficult to compare apples and bananas in this sense. I think the one thing you can say, picking up the thread here, is that Russia is very heavily dependent on mercenary groups. But what's fascinating is when Putin was on a platform with the French president only a year ago, he denied that the Russians had anything to do whatsoever with the Wagner mercenary group. And only a year later, he's making statements that it's been fully funded by the state for many years. I think part of the challenge is that I agree with particularly Colin, I think it was, who said, that we can expect to continue to see these groups being used. But I suspect that from Putin's perspective, having a 50,000 strong Wagner force is probably not the answer. He will have been used to controlling oligarchs. Let's face it, Yevgeny Prigozhin was an oligarch. By controlling the access to the contracts that they have. But of course, as soon as you have military force at your disposal and you increase the size of that military, if you remember the use of convicts to swell the numbers of the Wagner force, based on the premise that almost certainly Putin thought that the Russian population would care less about convicts losing their lives than local soldiers. But I don't think we've seen the end of mercenary groups, and certainly not the way that Russia uses them.
Let me bring in a quote here. This one's from the Guardian newspaper. Now, it's a little bit loose, this quote, because the Guardian was reporting a source in Libya who remained anonymous because they were party to conversations that were taking place between Libyan officials and Wagner officials. There will be no problem here. There may be some changes at the top, but the mechanism will stay the same. The people on the ground, the money men in Dubai, the contacts, the resources, those are all still committed to Libya. This is according to an envoy who was talking to, as I mentioned, a Libyan official. Don't worry, he went on to say, we aren't going anywhere. Colin, do you think that's the case, or do you think are they going to get new badges, or does everyone get recalled to Russia? Then you reissue more soldiers back out to Mali and Sudan and the other places that they are?
Russia is in a predicament with this here, in that it is as Sean was saying, heavily reliant, perhaps more so than other organisations for this, but also that groups like Wagner have a key role. They can do things that traditional military structures can't do. They can go places, they can fight in certain wars, they can be denied, and there's a less accountability for them. But on the flip side to that, the idea that Wagner is a professional military force is also questionable. Their recruitment strategy has been from prisoners on a kind of redemption kind of mantra. They recruit from kind of gyms, sort of disenfranchised young men. Quite a lot of militaries do that generally, but the idea that they are this kind of profound fighting force rather than a kind of rabble is open to contest, I would say.
Paul, are you in agreement with that?
Yes, I think that there's a certain level at which these forces in particular have been used rather for disruption rather than formal fighting. And it's quite interesting to see that Prigozhin himself was the main force behind the internet farms that were used as very effective tools of disruption. And he's the main Russian accused of interfering with the US election in 2016. So I think we can see this not as a formal add-on to the Russian forces, but rather a disruptive force, a force that Putin has used very effectively in the past as a way of disrupting in a left field sort of way.
Sean, I'm going to bring this to you. I'm going to put it a little bit differently. Do you think that this affects whether Russia can win this war in Ukraine or not? And we can argue about exactly what a win eked out by the Russians would be here, but does this in any way damage them more or prevent them from being able to win? Can they recover from it?
Well, there's a few questions there. The short answer is this can't help Russia. They've relied so heavily. One of the few battlefield successes they had was at Bakhmut. If you recall, that was sort of 11 months of intense fighting, and it was the mercenary group that delivered success there. So it almost certainly won't help them. But picking up the point as well, I think one key point about mercenaries, if they're conducting training activities or disruption activities, as my colleagues suggested, that will continue to happen. But once you use them to fight your war, the lack of professionalism, what we mean by that is they don't subscribe to the law of armed conflict, they don't subscribe to the Geneva Convention, they don't have any formal training. And as a result, the war crimes that are committed are still Putin's war crimes. The fact that they're being conducted by a rabble who don't care about their country, don't care about their colleagues, they just care about the money in their pocket and surviving, that absolutely breaks many of the rules and laws of armed conflict. And I'm pretty convinced that at the end of the war, not yet, but at the end of the war, Putin will come to regret some of those decisions.
Colin, I'm assuming, again, that you agree with that. So let me take this across to you in a slightly different way. What do you think Ukraine gets out of this?
Well, I think that Ukraine, to some extent, gets a we told you so from this. Not that they were struggling to make believers of us, but it certainly adds to the weight of particularly Zelensky's message that what Russia is doing is it should be condemned and is potentially an international criminal act. So the momentum for obtaining global hearts and minds has very much fallen even further towards Ukraine, and that's really important. I mean, today, despite the battlefield, the physical battlefield being in eastern Ukraine, we now live in a digital age where the communications battlefield is global here, and we see the Russian prestige shrinking even further. So those countries that were perhaps on the periphery, or perhaps not particularly aligning themselves one way or another, are now much more dubious about Russia, and that is an important development.
Do you think, Colin, that Putin survives this, or is this just sort of another one of the road bumps that he generally manages to breeze his way through? Or do you think this time, no, this is much more significant than any other problems he's faced in the past?
I think the way to see this is, first of all, we don't actually know what this is, because even this morning, Lukashenko was saying that Prigozhin is in Russia. So it might be that this is all smoke and mirrors, and actually Wagner's still very much a part of the Russian arsenal. So we just don't know. If this was a direct challenge to Putin's power, then yes, he is ultimately weakened by this scenario. And what that does to him long term is open to question. We should also say that Putin's been in power for 23 and a half years and is now in his early 70s. And there may well be a process of moving forward in terms of Russian leadership generally. The problem with that is that there would be a power vacuum here, because there isn't really any obvious contender to replace Putin from the kind of Putin-friendly side of things. There's obviously people like Alexei Navalny, but ultimately Putin has created a political system in Russia where challengers are few and far between.
Paul, I suppose this is a question that Putin now has to be asking himself in the back of his mind is, does he begin to set up a succession here? Or can he not even risk elevating anyone up as a possible successor because he's too scared?
I mean, when Prigozhin was involved in his mutiny or his threat, the US state was very concerned about the security of the Russian nuclear arsenal. And so we do have a situation where Putin's sitting there, he's weak, he's losing a war, or at least he could well be losing a war quite soon, and he's sitting on several thousand deployed nuclear weapons. And it's very difficult to know what to do in that sort of situation where chaos and shifting of power is a source of very deep uncertainty at a time when there are significant threats of nuclear use. And I think we all have to be aware of that challenge.
Sean, I'm going to lift out one of the quotes from the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, there, since he was brought up by Colin. He was asked about what's going to happen to the Wagner forces when they come into Belarus. A lot of conspiracy theories surrounding this. Some people are obviously fans of Vladimir Putin, saying it was some kind of 4-dimensional or 5-dimensional chess to move some of his forces across into Belarus so they could attack northern Ukraine. Others saying, well, he needs those forces in Belarus because then he can maybe take over Belarus himself, which seems odd if he can't take over Ukraine. But here's what Lukashenko said.
As far as I know, as of this morning, the fighters, the very serious fighters of Wagner PMC are in their permanent camps, the ones where they have been after they were withdrawn from the front line to recover and rest. The rotation is underway, which is usual for such a war. After Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, they were brought back to their camps, and they are currently there today. Regarding Yevgeny Vasilyevich Prigozhin, or Viktorovich, right? He is in St. Petersburg. Where is he this morning? He might have left for Moscow or for somewhere else, but he's not on Belarusian territory.
So what does this mean for stability in that area?
Well, firstly, I'd quote Colin and say we don't know. I mean, there's so much we don't know about what's going on. What I have to say, let's rule one off the table. If Putin had wanted to pre-position Wagner troops into Belarus, frankly, there are a lot easier ways of doing it. He could have put them on a bus and just moved them across. There are Russian forces that are doing military training in Belarus. Belarus is acted as host for military operations against Ukraine. There's Air Force assets, and now Putin's moving tactical nuclear weapons in. So there'd be a lot easier ways than having Wagner march on Moscow and all of the attendant friction that entailed. I think there's two things I would point out, one of which is Lukashenko is a puppet of Putin, is only kept in power by Putin. And the second one is that in the long term, people believe that part of Putin's strategy is to try to subjugate Ukraine and Belarus. His military forces have failed really in Ukraine, although he'll have his eye on the long game. Belarus, he's already got thousands of soldiers in Belarus. He could easily now, not easily, but it would not be difficult for him to take Belarus if all of his soldiers suddenly turned on the Belarusian military. And therefore, this could all be part of a play to take Belarus by stealth.
Paul, how does the West prepare for Vladimir Putin either stepping down or being removed?
So I think that the Americans will be looking at ways of ensuring that they don't contribute to instability. that if there are forces within the Russian establishment that could take over in a managed way, they will be seeking ways and means to facilitate that.
Colin, how does the West prepare for it? It's almost impossible, but you've got to do it.
Look, if Putin wanted Prigozhin out of the way, he would be dead by now. So there is an element of smoke and mirrors here. He could end up like Litvinenko or Skripal or Boris Berezovsky or somebody like that. So ultimately, Prigozhin still holds some degree of power here, and he is important to Putin's plan. So which tells me that there is still an element of currency, and Putin still has an element of currency and capital, and does still have a number of the key sort of cards up his sleeve.
Sean, Colin, Paul, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me today. I'm afraid that is all that we have time for, but if you want to see more discussion and debate, head on over to our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World and you'll find us there. But for now, from me and the entire team, thank you for watching and goodbye.